Margaret Stone stood against the dawn, her silhouette carved from iron and disappointment. The ranch hands knew better than to meet her gaze. Those gray eyes had frozen harder men than them. 20 years she'd built this empire of sage and cattle, each fence post driven deep as the hurt that made her. "That's shoddy work, Jenkins," she said, examining the broken fence line. "Collect your pay and go." The dismissed man shuffled away. Margaret didn't watch. Weakness was a luxury she'd surrendered long ago, when her parents died, leaving nothing but debt and determination. That evening, she sat alone with her ledgers, the coal oil lamp casting shadows like companions she'd never permit. In the locked drawer lay a tintype of her parents, their faces worn from her secret touching. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled its understanding. Some women were meant for solitude. She'd made peace with that. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The knock came at dusk, when decent folk were already settled in for the evening. Margaret's hand moved instinctively toward her father's Winchester mounted above the mantel before she caught herself. Through the window, she saw them, a man and boy, travel-worn and standing respectfully back from her door. She opened it only halfway. "We're not hiring." The man removed his battered hat, revealing hair the color of autumn wheat. "Not looking for permanent work, ma'am. Name's Thomas Brennan. This is my boy, Samuel." His voice carried the careful dignity of a man who'd learned to ask for little. "We've been walking since Laramie. Got turned around in yesterday's rain. I'm a fair carpenter. Noticed your fence needs mending. Would gladly fix it and trade for a night's shelter in your barn." "I don't take in drifters." The words came sharp as winter frost. "There's a town 12 miles east." "It's getting dark, ma'am." Thomas's jaw tightened, but his tone remained level. "The boy's been walking since dawn." Margaret's gaze shifted to the child 7, maybe 8 years old. His clothes bore the telltale patches of poverty she knew too well. Osnaburg cloth sewn with careful stitches. Some mother's last act of love, perhaps. The boy stepped forward, removing his threadbare cap with surprising formality. "Please, ma'am." His small hand reached back for his father's calloused one. "I promise we'll be quiet. Papa says I'm good at being quiet." That gesture, that trusting reach for comfort, struck Margaret like a physical blow. She saw herself at that age, clutching her father's hand outside the poorhouse, begging the superintendent for time to find work. The same hollow cheeks, the same brave pretense that exhaustion wasn't weighing down those thin shoulders. One night, the words escaped before she could stop them. "The barn's clean? There's a pump for water. You're gone at first light." Thomas's relief flickered briefly across his weathered face. "We're grateful, ma'am. You won't regret." "I already do." Margaret cut him off, though her voice had lost its edge. She disappeared inside, returning with a barn lantern and 2 thick blankets that smelled of cedar. "These are a loan, not a gift. I'll know if anything's missing come morning." "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." She shut the door without acknowledging his thanks, but stood at the window watching their silhouettes make their way to the barn. The boy's small form stumbled once, and his father's arm came around him, steady and sure. Margaret turned away, disturbed by the ache beneath her ribs. Margaret hadn't slept properly in years, but this night was different. She found herself padding to the window every hour, peering toward the barn through the darkness. Were they truly there, or had she dreamed the whole encounter at 3 in the morning? She saw the faint glow of the lantern she'd loaned them, steady and unmoving. They hadn't fled with it, at least. Strange dreams plagued the few moments of sleep she managed. Memories she'd buried deep. Her mother's hands, red from lye soap, mending their only dress. Her father's shame when the mine closed, leaving them with nothing. The taste of potato skin soup, stretched to last 3 days. She woke with her pillow damp, angry at these strangers for stirring up what she'd worked so hard to forget. Dawn came gray and reluctant, typical for late September in Wyoming. Margaret dressed with her usual efficiency wool skirt, practical blouse, her mother's worn cameo the only decoration she permitted herself. She'd send them on their way with perhaps a bit of cornbread for the road. The boy's thin face haunted her conscience just enough for that small mercy. She stepped onto the porch, expecting to find them still asleep, preparing her words of dismissal. Instead, she stopped short. Down by the eastern fence line, two figures were already at work. Thomas had his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the morning chill, setting a new post with practiced swings of her hammer. The boy Samuel stood beside him, holding the rail steady with determined concentration, his small hands purple with cold. Margaret walked closer, her boots crunching on frost-stiffened grass. Neither heard her approach over the rhythmic ring of hammer on nail. She studied the work already completed 30 feet of fence, maybe more, repaired with a craftsmanship that put her former ranch hands to shame. The posts were set true, the rails aligned perfectly, the whole structure solid as the mountains beyond. "You're using my tools." It came out as an accusation, though she hadn't meant it to. Thomas straightened, not startled, but calm, as if he'd been expecting her. "Yes, ma'am. Found them in the barn, right where they should be. They needed some oil, hope you don't mind. I always say a tool cared for is a job half done. I didn't hire you." "No, ma'am." He set the hammer down carefully on a flat stone, not dropping it in the dirt like Jenkins would have. "But the fence needed fixing, and I was awake. Seemed the right thing, considering your hospitality." "Papa couldn't sleep," Samuel piped up, his young voice bright despite his shivers. "He never can in new places. So we came out to see the stars. And then Papa said we might as well be useful." Margaret looked at the boy more closely. His cheeks were red with cold, but his eyes sparkled with pride at helping his father. When was the last time she'd seen such simple joy in work? "How long have you been out here?" "Since about 4, ma'am," Thomas answered. "We're early risers by nature." 4 o'clock. In the cold and dark, this stranger had risen to repair her fence without promise of payment, without being asked. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, rusty gears grinding against 20 years of practiced distrust. "You'll catch your death in this cold without breakfast," she heard herself saying. "Both of you." Thomas blinked, clearly surprised. "We don't want to impose a 'you already have,'" but the sting had left her words. "Might as well have something hot before you go. I've got bacon that needs using and sourdough that won't keep." She turned toward the house, not waiting for their response. After a moment, she heard their footsteps following. At the door, Thomas stopped. "Boots off, if you please," Margaret said. "And wash up. The pitcher and basin are there." She busied herself at the stove, grateful for the familiar routine. Coffee beans in the hand mill, the comfortable rhythm of grinding. Bacon in the cast iron skillet, filling the kitchen with its warm scent. She set out 3 plates, her good ones. The blue willow china that had been her mother's pride then caught herself. What was she doing? "This is real nice, ma'am," Samuel said, looking around the kitchen with wonder. "Like a picture book." Margaret glanced around, trying to see it through his eyes. The copper pots gleaming on their hooks, the checkered curtains she'd sewn herself, the preserved vegetables lined up like jewels in their mason jars. She'd never thought of it as nice. Functional? Yes. Efficient. "But nice, sit," she commanded, placing plates before them. The food disappeared with a speed that told her they'd been hungry longer than just this morning. "This is the best bacon I ever had," Samuel declared, then looked at his father nervously. "Except for Mama's. I mean, your mother's been gone 2 years, son," Thomas said quietly. "I think she'd understand." Margaret poured more coffee, processing this information. A widower and his boy, making their way alone. She knew that particular weight of loss. "You're a skilled carpenter," she said finally. "That fence work is professional quality. Had my own shop in Nebraska before." Thomas stopped, his jaw tightening. "Before circumstances changed." Circumstances. Margaret knew all about those too. The banker's smile as he foreclosed, the satisfaction in neighbors' eyes watching the mighty fall. "I need help through harvest season," she heard herself say. "Room and board, plus wages. Fair wages for fair work." Thomas set down his coffee cup carefully. "Ma'am, you heard me. 1 week trial. If your work stays this quality, you can stay through winter if you've a mind to. The barn's warm enough. I've had hands winter there before. There's a stove." "Why?" Thomas asked, his eyes searching hers with uncomfortable directness. Margaret stood, beginning to clear the dishes. "Because that fence won't repair itself, Mr. Brennan. And I'm tired of hiring men who can't tell a hammer from a horseshoe. This is business, nothing more." But as Samuel's face lit up with joy, bouncing in his seat with excitement, Margaret knew she was lying. This was something else entirely, something she didn't have words for yet. Something dangerous to everything she'd built these walls to protect. "We accept," Thomas said simply. "And ma'am, thank you." Margaret nodded brusquely, turning to the wash basin so they wouldn't see her face. "Finish your breakfast. There's work to do." Outside, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting golden light across her land. For the first time in 20 years, the sight didn't feel quite so lonely. The week that followed challenged everything Margaret Stone thought she knew about hired help. She'd grown accustomed to lazy drifters who did the minimum required, watching the sun's position more closely than their work. Thomas Brennan was cut from different cloth entirely. On the second morning, she found him in the tool shed at dawn, every implement laid out on old horse blankets he'd found and cleaned. He had Samuel beside him, the boy's attention rapt as his father explained the proper care of each tool. "See this rust here, son?" Thomas ran his thumb along a saw blade. "That's what happens when we don't respect our tools. They can't do their job if we don't do ours first." "Like when you oil your boots so they don't crack?" Samuel asked, his young voice serious with concentration. "Exactly like that. Everything needs tending." Thomas reached for a tin of petroleum jelly, working it into the metal with patient strokes. "Your mama used to say tools are like people, treat them rough. They'll fail you when you need them most." Margaret retreated before they could notice her, but the conversation echoed in her mind as she went about her morning routines. Through the kitchen window, she watched them work. Thomas had somehow transformed her chaotic tool shed into a model of organization within 3 days. Saws hung by size, hammers nested in a rack he'd built from scrap wood, nails sorted into glass jars by length. What struck her most was how he never sat idle. When the fence work was done, he moved to the loose barn door. When that was fixed, he reinforced the chicken coop, all without being asked, without seeking praise. He worked like a man who found dignity in labor itself, not in recognition. Samuel, meanwhile, had taken to the chickens with endearing seriousness. She watched him now through the parlor window, carrying the feed bucket that was nearly as big as he was, talking conversationally to the birds as they pecked around his feet. "Now, Henrietta," he scolded a particularly pushy Rhode Island red. "You've had your share. Let Beatrice have some too. Papa says sharing is what separates us from animals. Though I guess that don't make sense since you're animals and I'm asking you to share." He paused, puzzling over this contradiction, then shrugged. "Well, you're special animals, I suppose." Margaret found herself smiling, then caught herself. When had she last smiled at something so simple? The boy had named every chicken within his first day, creating elaborate personalities for each. The rooster, a mean-tempered bird Margaret had considered stew-pot material, Samuel had christened General Grump and somehow made friends with him through patient offerings of corn. That evening, she adjusted the food portions without comment, adding extra potatoes to the pot, cutting thicker slices of bread. The hollow look had already begun leaving Samuel's cheeks, and she remembered too well the gnawing emptiness of childhood hunger. No child would go hungry under her roof, even if that child was temporary. They ate in customary silence at first, the only sound the clink of forks against plates. Then General Grump started raising a ruckus outside, his crows increasingly indignant. He's probably seen his shadow again, Samuel said, rolling his eyes with exaggerated exasperation. This morning he fought with it for 10 whole minutes. Papa had to explain it was just him, but I don't think General Grump believed it. He kept looking behind himself all suspicious-like, trying to catch it sneaking up. Thomas coughed, clearly suppressing a laugh. The boy's got an imagination, ma'am. I hope the talking doesn't disturb you. The chickens seemed to like it, Margaret said carefully. Egg production's up since you arrived. Really? Samuel's eyes went wide. Did you hear that? Papa, I'm helping. You are indeed, Thomas said, ruffling his son's hair with gentle affection. The gesture sparked something in Margaret's chest, a memory of her own father's rare but cherished displays of affection. She cleared her throat. Mr. Brennan, might I ask what brought a skilled carpenter to wander the territories? Thomas's face stilled. He set down his fork deliberately, seeming to weigh his words. Had a shop in Grand Island. Good business. Steady customers. When Mary, my wife, took sick, the doctor bills. He paused, his knuckles white where he gripped his coffee cup. Lost the shop, then the house. After she passed. Seemed like staying would be letting grief swallow us both whole. So we started walking. Figured somewhere out here, there'd be work for willing hands and space for a boy to grow. Papa says we're on an adventure, Samuel added, though his young voice carried a note of uncertainty. Like in the books Mama used to read. Your mother read to you, Margaret found herself asking. Every night, Samuel said proudly. She knew all the words, even the big ones. Papa tries, but he says Mama had the voice for it. She was a schoolteacher before we married, Thomas explained. Gave it up because, well, married women couldn't teach. But she never stopped learning, never stopped filling that boy's head with stories and dreams. Margaret rose abruptly, busying herself at the stove. The picture they painted, a small family broken by loss but held together by love, stirred emotions she'd buried with her parents. There's preserved peaches, she said, her back to them. Might as well have them before they turn. She served the peaches in her good bowls, the crystal ones she never used. Samuel's eyes went round as saucers. This is like Christmas. It's just peaches, boy, Margaret said, but without her usual sharpness. After supper, Samuel produced something from his pocket, approaching her chair with unusual shyness. I made this for you, ma'am. In his small palm lay a wooden horse, no bigger than a child's thumb. The detail was remarkable flowing mane, alert ears, legs captured mid-gallop. It had been carved with obvious care and surprising skill. Papa's teaching me, Samuel explained. He says I got good hands for it. I made this one special for you because... He stopped, looking down at his feet. Because what? Margaret asked, her voice softer than she'd heard it in years. Because you don't smile much, ma'am. And Mama used to say that everyone needs something small and beautiful to look at when the world gets too big and dark. She had a little glass bird. Papa has Mama's wedding ring. I thought maybe you needed something too. Margaret took the horse with hands that trembled slightly. The wood was smooth, polished with what must have been hours of patient rubbing. This is... Her voice caught. This is fine work. Samuel, thank you. The boy beamed, his whole face transformed with joy. Papa helped with the legs. They're the hardest part. Only steadied his hand, Thomas corrected. The boy's got natural talent. Gets it from his mother's side. Her father was a furniture maker back in Ohio. Margaret turned the horse in the lamplight, watching shadows play across its carved muscles. When had anyone last given her a gift that wasn't payment or obligation? I'll treasure it, she said, meaning it. That night, after they'd returned to the barn, Margaret sat in her parlor chair, the little wooden horse on the table beside her. She picked it up periodically, running her fingers over its smooth surface. Such a small thing, yet it had cracked something open inside her, some door she'd barred and bolted 20 years ago. Through the window, She could see lamplight in the barn. Thomas would be teaching Samuel his letters. Probably, maintaining his wife's educational legacy despite his own limited schooling. The dedication of it, the quiet determination to give his son better than he'd had it was admirable. More than admirable. Margaret made a decision. Rising, she pulled on her shawl and walked to the barn. Thomas looked up from where he sat with Samuel, a worn primer spread between them on a crate. "Mr. Brennan," she said formally, "I've decided. You'll stay through winter. The work you've done this week would have taken my previous hands a month, and done poorly at that. Harvest starts in 2 weeks. I'll need reliable help." Thomas stood slowly. "Ma'am, we're grateful. It's business." Margaret interrupted, though her tone lacked conviction. "Nothing more. Samuel, there are readers in the house that are going unused. You may borrow them, if you're careful." The boy's face lit up like sunrise. "Real books with stories." "Real books," Margaret confirmed, "including some your mother might have known." As she walked back to the house, she heard Samuel's excited chatter and Thomas's deep, warm laughter. The sound followed her inside, filling spaces that had been silent too long. On the mantel, she placed the wooden horse where morning light would catch it. For the first time in 20 years, Margaret Stone's house felt less like a fortress and more like what it was always meant to be, a home waiting to be filled. Sunday arrived with the weight of obligation Margaret had carried for 20 years. She rose before dawn for her weekly bathing ritual, heating water on the stove and filling the copper hip bath she kept in her bedroom. The horsehair bustle petticoat came out of its tissue paper wrapping, along with her one good dress, black bombazine with jet buttons. Severe, but respectable. Church attendance wasn't negotiable for a woman of property who wanted to maintain her business relationships. She'd told Thomas and Samuel about church the night before, carefully casual. "There's service at 10. You're welcome to attend, though I won't think less if you choose otherwise." Thomas had simply nodded. "We'll be ready, ma'am. Samuel needs the structure, and I could use the peace." Now, as her buggy rolled toward town with Thomas and Samuel on the wagon seat beside her, Margaret felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with public appearances. She'd learned to armor herself against the stares, the whispers, the careful distances other women kept. But today felt different. Today she wasn't arriving alone. The Methodist Church stood white and proud against the autumn sky, its bell tower calling the faithful with bronze authority. Margaret had paid for that bell, though few remembered now. She pulled the buggy to her usual spot, noting how conversations died as she descended. Margaret, Mrs. Prudence Hayes, the banker's wife, approached with her customary smile that never reached her eyes. "How unexpected to see you with company." "Mr. Brennan and his son are working my ranch through harvest," Margaret replied evenly. "It seemed appropriate to include them in the community worship." Prudence's gaze traveled over Thomas's clean but worn clothes, lingering on Samuel's patched knees. "How charitable of you. Though one must be careful about the company one keeps. People do talk." "Do they?" Margaret's voice could have frozen water. "How fortunate they have such time for leisure." She walked past Prudence without waiting for a response, aware of Thomas and Samuel following uncertainly. The church interior was already half full, the prominent families in their purchased pews, the less fortunate crowding the back benches. Margaret had inherited her family's pew 5th row, left side paid for in perpetuity by her father in more prosperous times. She slid in, leaving room for her companions. The whispers rose like disturbed birds. Is that the drifter she took in, bold as brass, bringing them here? "You know what they say about widow women who take in strange men." Samuel pressed closer to his father, his young face confused and hurt. Thomas sat rigid, his jaw clenched but expression carefully neutral. Margaret felt rage rise in her throat like bile. The service began with Reverend Phillips calling for the opening hymn. Margaret shared her hymnal with Samuel, whose eyes widened at the musical notations. I can't read the notes, he whispered anxiously. Just follow along with the words. Margaret whispered back, Your reading is fine. The sermon focused on charity and Christian duty, though Margaret noticed Reverend Phillips carefully avoided looking in her direction. His wife, however, made her feelings clear during the social hour afterward, approaching with a group of similarly minded women. Miss Stone, Mrs. Phillips said, her voice carrying deliberately, we must discuss your situation. While Christian charity is admirable, there are limits to what proper society can tolerate. Indeed. Margaret stood straighter. And what limits would those be, Mrs. Phillips? Unmarried women taking in strange men is hardly appropriate. Think of the example it sets for our young ladies. Margaret looked pointedly at Mrs. Phillips' daughter, who was making eyes at the Coleman boy despite his reputation for drinking. Yes, we must guard our young ladies carefully, from actual threats, not imagined ones. The threat to your reputation is hardly imagined, Prudence Hayes interjected. My husband mentioned it might affect your business dealings. Margaret turned slowly to face her. Is your husband threatening me, Mrs. Hayes? Of course not. He's simply concerned. Then I'll thank him to keep his concerns to himself. My ranch is the most profitable in the county. My beef feeds half this town through winter. If your husband wishes to explain to his investors why he severed ties with his best customer over gossip, he's welcome to try. She gathered her skirts and walked toward the door, pausing only to collect Thomas and Samuel, who stood uncertainly by the entrance. The walk to the buggy felt endless, every eye following their progress. Thomas helped her up, then climbed beside her. Samuel sat between them, unusually quiet. They were halfway back to the ranch before the boy spoke. Why were those ladies so mean? Miss Margaret. Margaret's hands tightened on the reins. How did one explain petty jealousy and social cruelty to a child? Sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand. Samuel. But what don't they understand? We're just fixing your fences and feeding your chickens. Exactly, Thomas said quietly. And that's all we're doing. Miss Stone, if our presence is causing you difficulties, don't. Margaret surprised herself with the sharpness of her refusal. Don't you dare offer to leave because of their small-mindedness. But your reputation. My reputation was ruined the day I refused to sell my land to banker Hayes for a fraction of its worth. It was destroyed again when I dismissed his nephew for stealing, and again when I outbid him for the water rights to Sage Creek. This is merely their latest excuse. She pulled the buggy to a stop at the ranch gate, turning to face Thomas directly. I've spent 20 years caring what this town thinks. 20 years of perfect behavior, proper dress, appropriate distances. And what has it earned me? Nothing but cold shoulders and whispered judgments. I choose my own company. Mr. Brennan. If they don't like it, they can take their business to Whitman's ranch and see how they enjoy his watered-down beef and short waits. Thomas studied her for a long moment. You're a brave woman, Miss Stone. No, she said, climbing down from the buggy. I'm just tired of being afraid. Monday brought the confrontation she'd expected. Banker Hayes himself appeared at her door, hat in hand, but authority in his bearing. Margaret, we need to discuss this situation. She didn't invite him in. What situation would that be? Josiah. This man you've hired. People are talking. People are always talking. It's their primary occupation. His face reddened. This is different. You're housing a drifter and his boy. It's unseemly. What's unseemly is you standing on my porch trying to dictate my choices. She stepped forward, forcing him to step back. Thomas Brennan has done more work in 2 weeks than your nephew did in 6 months. His son is polite and helpful. They pay for their keep with honest labor. If that offends you, perhaps you should examine why. I'm trying to protect you. From what hard workers, decent people, or just from anyone you haven't personally approved. Hayes's mask slipped, revealing the calculation beneath. You're making enemies. Margaret, powerful ones. I made those enemies long ago. Josiah. At least now I have friends to balance them. She shut the door in his face, her heart pounding. Through the window, she watched him stride angrily to his carriage. Within hours, she knew the story would be all over town, embellished with each telling. That afternoon, she found Thomas in the barn, mending harnesses with focused precision. "We had a visitor," she said. He looked up, reading her expression. "Banker Hayes, warning me about enemies and reputation." Thomas set down his work, standing slowly. "Miss Stone, I meant what I said yesterday. We can leave. Find work elsewhere. You've been kind to us, but not at the cost of your position here." "My position?" Margaret laughed, but it was bitter. "My position is what it's always been, an outsider who refuses to play by their rules. Your presence changes nothing except that now I have help worth having." "But Samuel, the way they looked at him will make him stronger or break him, but running won't teach him either lesson." She paused, softening. "Unless you want to leave, I won't hold you to our agreement if you're uncomfortable." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. "Samuel asked me this morning if we were bad people. If that's why the church folks stared, I told him that good people sometimes face judgment for doing right, that standing up for what's true is harder than going along with what's easy." He met her eyes. "I'd like to stay, if you'll have us. Let them talk." Margaret felt something ease in her chest. "Then we understand each other." That evening at supper, Samuel was quieter than usual, pushing his food around his plate. Finally, he looked up at Margaret with those two serious young eyes. "Miss Margaret, I don't want you to be in trouble because of us." She set down her fork, choosing her words carefully. "Samuel, do you remember what your father told you about caring for tools?" He nodded. "That if we don't respect them, they can't do their job. People are the same. If I don't respect myself enough to make my own choices, then I can't do my job properly. My job is to run this ranch as I see fit, to treat people fairly, and to live according to my own conscience, not theirs. So we're not leaving, not unless you want to." Samuel's face broke into his first real smile since Sunday. "Good. General Grump would miss me something awful. He told me so this morning." Thomas coughed to cover a laugh. Margaret found herself smiling too. "Well," she said, "we can't disappoint General Grump." As she cleared the dishes, Margaret realized the house felt different, fuller. The silence that had once comforted her now felt incomplete when Thomas and Samuel returned to the barn each night. But that was dangerous thinking. This was business, she reminded herself, nothing more. Yet when she placed Samuel's carved horse on her nightstand before bed, she knew she was lying. This was becoming something else entirely. Something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. October arrived with teeth. The storm rolled in from the north just after sunset, bringing winds that howled like wounded animals and rain that struck the windows like fistfuls of gravel. Margaret had seen such storms before they could last days, tearing at anything loose, flooding the low places, making the world a gray prison of water and wind. She'd just finished securing the shutters when Thomas appeared at her kitchen door, Samuel in his arms, both soaked through despite the short distance from the barn. "The roof's gone," Thomas said without preamble. "Tore clean off the south side. Everything's flooded." Margaret didn't hesitate. "Come in, quickly." They stood dripping in her kitchen, Samuel shivering violently, his lips tinged blue. Margaret grabbed towels from the washstand, her mind already calculating. "There are dry clothes in the chest upstairs, my father's things. They should fit well enough. Samuel can wear one of my old nightshirts. We can't impose. You can't stay in a barn with no roof either." She was already moving, lighting additional lamps against the storm dark. "This isn't charity. Mr. Brennan, I need you both healthy for harvest. Now get changed before the boy catches his death." She busied herself stoking the fire, heating water for tea, trying not to think about the implications of having them in her house. The storm made the decision for her. She reasoned, nothing more. Thomas returned in her father's clothes, a flannel shirt and wool trousers that fit him surprisingly well. Samuel was wrapped in a nightshirt that dragged the floor, his face pale except for 2 bright spots of color on his cheeks. "He's warm," Thomas said, his hand on the boy's forehead. "Started on the run over." Margaret touched Samuel's head, feeling the heat radiating from his skin. Fear shot through her like lightning. "Fever. Get him by the fire." She spread her mother's candlewick bedspread on the horsehair sofa, making a nest of quilts. Samuel curled into it, his small body shaking with chills despite the fever. Margaret's hands moved without conscious thought, reaching for remedies she hadn't used in 20 years. "I need willow bark from the pantry," she told Thomas. "And the blue bottle on the 3rd shelf laudanum, but only a few drops for someone his size." She set water to boil, adding pine needles from the bundle she kept for cleaning. The steam would help his breathing. From her mother's medicine box, untouched for decades, she pulled mustard powder for a plaster. "You know healing," Thomas observed, watching her sure movements. "Necessity taught me." She mixed the mustard plaster with practiced efficiency. "When you're poor, you learn or you watch people die." Samuel whimpered as she applied the warm plaster to his chest, covering it with flannel. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. "Mama," he called weakly. "Mama, I'm cold." Thomas's face crumpled. He knelt beside his son, taking the small hand in both of his. "It's Papa, son. You're safe." "My brother called for our mother, too," Margaret said quietly, preparing the willow bark tea. "The fever took him when he was 7, just Samuel's age." Thomas looked up sharply. "I didn't know you had a brother." "Had—" She measured 3 drops of laudanum into the tea. "His name was James. Jamie. We called him. He was everything sweet in our family, the laughter, the hope. When the fever came, we did everything. Sold Mother's wedding ring for medicine. Father walked 20 miles through snow for a doctor. Nothing helped." She lifted Samuel's head, coaxing the tea between his lips. The boy swallowed reflexively, then turned his face into his father's shoulder. "Mary went the same way," Thomas said, his voice rough. "2 winters ago. Started as a cough, turned to fever. I sold everything the shop. Our furniture, her books. Every doctor in Nebraska saw her. She died anyway, asking me to take care of Samuel." His voice broke. "I couldn't save her. If I can't save him, you will." Margaret's voice was fierce. "We will. He's strong, and we caught it early." The storm raged outside, shaking the house to its foundations. They took turns bathing Samuel's face with cool cloths, monitoring his breathing, coaxing sips of tea and water between his cracked lips. The fever climbed higher as midnight approached. "Tell me about his mother," Margaret said, needing to fill the terrible silence between thunder crashes. Thomas's hands never stopped their gentle stroking of Samuel's hair. "Mary was light. That's the only way I can describe her. She made everything brighter just by being near it. Educated. Too, her father was a professor back east. She could have married anyone, but she chose me. Never could understand why." "Perhaps she saw what I see," Margaret said without thinking, then froze. Thomas looked at her across Samuel's fevered form. "What do you see?" The lamplight flickered, casting shadows that made the moment feel removed from time. "A man who does right because it's right, not for praise. Who teaches his son to be gentle with chickens and careful with tools. Who fixes fences at dawn without being asked." She looked away. "Mary chose well." "She would have liked you," Thomas said softly. "She always said the strongest people were the ones who'd been broken and chose to mend rather than stay sharp edges." Samuel stirred, mumbling incoherently. His fever had reached its peak, Margaret could feel it radiating from his small body like a stove. This was the crisis point. She'd seen it with Jamie, the moment when the body either fought back or surrendered. "We need to break the fever," she said. "Help me carry him to the kitchen." They laid him on the kitchen table. Stripping the sweat-soaked nightshirt, Margaret packed snow-cooled cloths around him while Thomas held him steady. Samuel cried out, fighting weakly against the cold. "I know, sweet boy," Margaret found herself crooning. "I know it hurts." The endearment slipped out naturally, surprising her. When had this child become sweet boy to her? When had his suffering become her own pain? She began to sing, almost without thinking, her mother's Irish lullaby, the one she'd sung to Jamie as he lay dying. "Oro, se do beatha baile, is fear liom tu natsead bobine." The ancient words rose through the storm sound, a thread of beauty in the darkness. Thomas watched her with something like wonder. "What is it?" "My mother's song, from Galway. She sang it when we were sick or scared." Tears ran down Margaret's face unchecked. "I sang it to Jamie at the end. Held him, and sang until he couldn't hear anymore." "Sing it for Samuel," Thomas said. "So he knows we're here." So she sang, verse after verse. While the storm battered the house and Samuel fought his battle with fever, Thomas joined her on the chorus once he caught the melody, his baritone rough but true. Their voices twined together in the lamplight, holding vigil against death. Near dawn, the fever broke. It happened suddenly. One moment Samuel was burning. The next his skin cooled and dampened with healthy sweat. His eyes opened, truly seeing for the first time in hours. "Papa." His voice was weak but clear. "Miss Margaret, why are you crying?" Margaret hadn't realized she was still weeping. She touched his face, feeling the blessed coolness. "Happy tears, Samuel. You're going to be fine." "I had strange dreams," the boy murmured. "Mama was there, but she said I had to come back. Said you needed me." Thomas made a sound between laugh and sob, gathering his son against his chest. Over Samuel's head, his eyes met Margaret's, without thinking. She reached out and squeezed his hand, a brief pressure of solidarity and relief. He turned his palm up, catching her fingers for just a moment before she pulled away. Suddenly aware of the intimacy, they tucked Samuel back onto the sofa, where he fell into a deep, healing sleep. The storm had begun to ease, though rain still drummed steadily on the roof. Margaret and Thomas sat in chairs on either side of the sleeping child, exhausted but unwilling to leave. "Thank you," Thomas said simply. "You saved him." "We saved him," Margaret corrected. "Together. That song, will you teach it to me properly?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. The night had stripped away 20 years of careful distance. She felt raw, exposed, but somehow not vulnerable. It was strange, this feeling of being seen and not finding it terrible. "Margaret," Thomas said, and she realized it was the first time he'd used her given name. "What you said, about what you see in me. The fever made me foolish," she said quickly. "Forget I spoke." "I don't want to forget." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "These weeks here, they've been... Samuel and I were just existing before, moving through days. But here, with you, it feels like living again." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "Thomas, I know this is just business for you. But for us, for me, it's become home. However long you'll let us stay." She wanted to agree, to retreat to the safety of employer and employee. But the night had torn down those walls. Samuel's fever had burned away pretense along with sickness. "It's not just business," she admitted in a whisper. "It hasn't been for some time." Outside, the dawn was breaking gray and quiet, the storm finally spent. Inside, something new was beginning, fragile as the morning light, but just as inevitable. Margaret reached out and took Thomas's hand properly this time. No brief squeeze, but a real clasping. They sat that way, hands linked across the space between chairs, watching Samuel sleep and breathe, while the sun slowly returned to the world. November arrived with frost on the windows and determination in the hearts of Sage Creek's self-appointed moral guardians. Margaret saw them coming from her kitchen window, 5 figures in their Sunday best despite it being Thursday, their carriages raising dust clouds like harbingers of judgment. She recognized Banker Hayes's matched grays immediately, then Dr. Morrison's modest buggy, followed by 3 riders she knew too well. "Thomas," she called toward the barn where he was working. "We have visitors." He emerged, taking in the procession with a quick assessment. Samuel appeared beside him, still thin from his fever 2 weeks prior but recovering well. The boy's face went pale. "Are they coming to make us leave?" Samuel asked, his voice small. Margaret knelt beside him, her hands on his shoulders. "No one makes decisions about this ranch except me. Remember that." And she stood, smoothing her apron. "Both of you, come inside. Stand with me." The delegation assembled on her porch like a jury. Banker Hayes held a rolled document tied with black ribbon. Dr. Morrison looked uncomfortable. The 3 others, Mrs. Phillips, Mayor Garrett, and Harold Whitman, the rival rancher, wore expressions of righteous satisfaction. "Gentlemen, ladies," Margaret didn't invite them in. "To what do I owe this formal visit?" Hayes unrolled the document with theatrical gravity. "Margaret Stone, we come as concerned citizens of Sage Creek to present a petition regarding the unsuitable situation at your ranch." "Unsuitable." Margaret's voice could have cut glass. "Please, elaborate." Mrs. Phillips stepped forward. "You've taken in vagrants, Margaret. It's destroying the moral fabric of our community." "Vagrants?" Margaret laughed, sharp and bitter. "Is that what we're calling skilled laborers now?" Mayor Garrett cleared his throat. "Miss Stone, be reasonable. A woman living with a man not her husband. Living with—" Margaret's eyes flashed. "Mr. Brennan and his son reside in the barn. Mayor, though after the storm damage, which none of you offered to help repair, I note they've been taking meals in my kitchen. Is eating together now a scandal?" "The appearance of impropriety," Dr. Morrison began, "is in your minds, not my actions." Margaret held out her hand. "Give me this petition." Hayes handed it over reluctantly. Margaret read it aloud, her voice steady despite her fury. "We, the undersigned citizens of Sage Creek, demand the immediate removal of the transient Thomas Brennan and his son from the property of Miss Margaret Stone for the preservation of public morality and the protection of Miss Stone's reputation." She looked at the signatures, 15 names, including some she'd considered friends. The wax seals gave it an official appearance, as if law rather than prejudice had authored it. "You demand," she said softly, dangerously. "You dare to demand." "Margaret." Whitman spoke for the first time, his voice oily with false concern. "We're trying to protect you. A woman alone can be taken advantage of. This drifter could be anyone, could have any intentions. His intentions," Margaret interrupted, "have been clear from the day he arrived. Mr. Brennan, would you please tell Mr. Whitman what you've accomplished in the past 6 weeks?" Thomas stepped forward, his presence solid and calm. "I've repaired 300 feet of fence, reinforced the barn structure, reorganized the tool shed, built new chicken coops, prepared the winter feed storage, and helped bring in half the harvest. Your own men haven't managed that much all season, Whitman." Whitman's face reddened. I dare speak the truth." Thomas replied evenly. "Something that seems in short supply today." Samuel tugged on Margaret's skirt. She looked down to see tears on his young face. "Miss Margaret," he whispered, loud enough for all to hear, "if Papa and I leaving would make things better for you, we'll go. We don't want you hurt 'cause of us." The innocence of the offer, the child willing to sacrifice his happiness for hers, struck Margaret like a physical blow. She knelt again, wiping his tears with her thumbs. "Samuel Brennan," she said firmly, You and your father have brought more good to this ranch in 6 weeks than these people have brought to this town in 6 years. You're not going anywhere." She stood, taking the petition in both hands. With deliberate slowness, she tore it in half, then quarters, then smaller pieces, letting them fall like snow at Hayes's feet. "This land is mine," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "My choices are mine. My judgment is mine. And I judge Thomas Brennan to be worth 10 of any man here." "You're making a mistake," Hayes warned. "There will be consequences. Your credit at the bank. My accounts are solid, and you know it. You need my business more than I need your bank." She looked at each of them in turn. "Dr. Morrison, shall I mention how I kept quiet when your son was caught stealing from the general store, Mrs. Phillips? Would you like to discuss your husband's drinking debts that I've covered to save your family embarrassment, Mayor Garrett? Should we talk about the town funds that went missing last year?" Each person stepped back as if slapped. Margaret hadn't wanted to use their secrets, but they'd forced her hand. "You come here speaking of morality while your own houses are built on lies and compromise. At least I'm honest about who I am and what I choose." A voice came from behind the delegation. "She's right." Everyone turned. Widow Patterson stood there, having walked from town, her worn boots dusty but her head high. She was flanked by 2 others, Ben Cooper, the freed slave who ran the smithy, and Maria Santos, who took in washing. "Begging your pardon for intruding, Miss Stone," Widow Patterson said, "but we saw these folks heading your way and figured you might need support." "We don't need the opinions of Mrs. Phillips began. But Widow Patterson cut her off. "Of who? The working people, the ones who actually keep this town running while you sit in your parlors judging everyone else." She moved to stand beside Margaret. "Miss Stone helped me when my husband died. No questions asked. Gave me credit when the bank wouldn't. That's Christian charity." Ben Cooper nodded. "She's the only rancher who pays fair wages, treats everyone equal. Don't matter if you're colored or white. If you work hard, she respects you." Maria Santos added in accented but clear English. "Mr. Thomas, he fixed my roof. No payment. Just saw it needed doing when he passed. These are good people." Margaret felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She hadn't known about Thomas fixing Maria's roof, hadn't realized these people considered her an ally. She'd been so focused on her own isolation she'd missed the quiet community of outsiders who understood her. Mayor Garrett attempted to salvage his authority. "Regardless of testimonials, the prominent citizens of this town, the prominent citizens," Margaret interrupted, "are welcome to take their business elsewhere. I'll be selling my beef directly to the railroad from now on. Better prices, less hypocrisy." Whitman started. "The railroad, but we have an agreement." "Had," past tense. Margaret smiled coldly. "I received a letter yesterday from the Union Pacific. They're very interested in a direct supplier, especially one with the quality of beef my ranch produces." It was a bluff she'd written to them but hadn't received a response yet. But Whitman didn't know that. Hayes's face had gone pale. Without Margaret's beef, supplying the town through winter would be difficult and expensive. "Now, Margaret, let's not be hasty." "Hasty? You brought a petition to my home demanding I dismiss the best help I've ever had because your wives are bored and your pride is wounded. That's hasty?" Thomas stepped forward. "Miss Stone, if I may." She nodded, curious. He faced the delegation squarely. "You call me a drifter, a vagrant. I'm a widower trying to raise his son with dignity. I work from dawn to dusk, teach my boy his letters and numbers, and pray every night for the strength to be the man my late wife believed I could be. If that threatens you, perhaps you should examine why." "Well said," Widow Patterson murmured. Samuel, emboldened by the support, stepped forward too. "My papa is the best man in the whole world, and Miss Margaret is the kindest lady, even if she pretends not to be. She saved me when I was sick. You're mean to want us to leave." The child's simple honesty cut through the pretense. Dr. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. He'd been the one to refuse coming during the storm, claiming it was too dangerous. "This isn't over," Hayes said, but his threat lacked conviction. "Yes, it is." Margaret's voice was steel. You came here thinking I'd crumble under social pressure, but I've survived worse than your disapproval. I survived poverty, death of everyone I loved, and 20 years of your cold shoulders. I'll survive this too. Mrs. Phillips gathered her skirts. You're choosing them over us, over society. I'm choosing integrity over hypocrisy. If that means losing your version of society, I consider it a gain. The delegation retreated, their carriages raising less dust and defeat than they had in arrival. But Widow Patterson, Ben Cooper, and Maria Santos remained. Thank you, Margaret said simply. I didn't expect. We outsiders need to stick together, Widow Patterson said with a warm smile. Besides, anyone can see that man looks at you like you hung the moon. About time you had some happiness. Margaret Stone. Margaret flushed, glancing at Thomas, who was studying his boots with suspicious intensity. We're not. Not yet, Maria said with a knowing smile. But spring comes after every winter. No. After they left, promising to spread word of Margaret's true character among the working families, Margaret stood on her porch with Thomas and Samuel. The torn petition pieces had blown across the yard like defeated birds. You didn't have to do that, Thomas said quietly. Stand against them for us. Yes, I did. She looked at him directly. A wise man recently told me that standing up for what's true is harder than going along with what's easy. Papa, does this mean we're staying forever? Samuel asked hopefully. Margaret and Thomas exchanged glances. We're staying as long as Miss Margaret will have us, Thomas said carefully. Forever, then, Samuel decided with the confidence of youth. Because she needs us, and we need her, and that's what family does. Margaret's eyes burned with unshed tears. Family. The word hung in the air like a promise, or perhaps a prophecy. She couldn't speak, but when Samuel slipped his small hand into hers, she held it tight. Thomas's hand touched her shoulder, brief but warm. Thank you, he said again, and she heard everything he couldn't say yet in those 2 words. As they went inside for the noon meal, Margaret realized she'd won more than just a battle with the town's morality committee. She'd found her people, the ones who saw her truly and stood with her anyway. It was more than she'd dared hope for in 20 years of carefully maintained solitude. December brought snow that transformed Sage Creek Ranch into something from a fairy tale. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching Thomas and Samuel build a snowman near the barn, their laughter carrying across the white blanketed yard. She couldn't remember the last time she'd heard such joy on her land or felt it warming her own chest. Miss Margaret, Samuel burst through the door, cheeks red as apples. Papa says we can cut a tree for Christmas if you want. Do you want? We never had a proper tree, not since Mama. He stopped, his young face clouding. Margaret knelt before him, brushing snow from his hair. I think your Mama would want you to have the most beautiful Christmas tree in Wyoming. And yes, I want one too. I haven't had one in a very long time. 20 years, to be exact. Not since her parents died that terrible winter, taking all celebration with them. Thomas appeared in the doorway, stomping snow from his boots. Sorry for him barging in. Margaret, he's excited. Don't apologize. This house needs some excitement. She stood, decision crystallizing. We'll make this a proper Christmas, the first of many. The words hung in the air, weighted with meaning none of them quite dared to acknowledge yet. Thomas's eyes met hers, holding questions and promises in equal measure. The first of many, he agreed softly. They spent the next week transforming the house. Thomas and Samuel brought in a perfect pine, small enough to fit in the parlor corner. Margaret retrieved decorations from the attic she hadn't touched in decades, glass ornaments wrapped in tissue, tarnished silver bells her mother had cherished. These are beautiful, Thomas said, carefully unwrapping a delicate angel. German, aren't they? My grandmother's. She brought them from Bavaria. Margaret touched the angel's porcelain face. I thought they'd be too painful to see again, but... She looked at Samuel, who was stringing popcorn with intense concentration, more kernels making it to his mouth than the string. Pain fades when you have reason to celebrate again. Thomas moved closer, his voice low. Margaret. These weeks since the town confrontation. Look, Miss Margaret. Samuel interrupted, holding up his popcorn string. I made it all by myself. The moment broke. But Thomas's hand briefly touched hers as they both reached to help the boy hang his creation. These almost moments had been happening more frequently, hands brushing over dishes, shoulders touching as they watched Samuel play. Conversations that went deeper than surface talk before one of them retreated. Margaret taught Samuel to make paper cornucopias, filling them with nuts she'd been saving. Thomas carved wooden ornaments in the evenings, tiny horses, stars, even a miniature General Grump that made Samuel giggle with delight. Together they made pomanders, studding oranges with cloves until the house smelled like Christmas itself. My mother's honey cake recipe, Margaret said one evening, pulling a worn card from her recipe box. I haven't made it since. Since she passed, Thomas guessed gently. Since Hope left this house. She traced the faded ink. But it's back now, isn't it, Hope? Yes, Thomas said simply. It is. The cake came out perfect, golden and fragrant with honey and spices. Samuel declared it the best thing he'd ever eaten, even better than the candy sticks Thomas had brought from town. The boy had blossomed in the months since their arrival, his thin frame filling out, his natural cheerfulness no longer shadowed by loss and uncertainty. Word had spread through the working families about Margaret's stand against the town elite. Her beef sales to smaller buyers had actually increased, and 3 new families had asked to buy milk and eggs directly from the ranch. The official coldness from the prominent citizens remained, but it mattered less each day. Thomas had proven invaluable as winter set in. He'd reinforced the barn properly roofed now, built furniture for the main house as if he already lived there, and managed the livestock with quiet efficiency. But more than his labor, it was his presence that had changed everything, his steady calm, his gentle humor, the way he looked at Margaret when he thought she wasn't watching. Christmas Eve arrived crisp and star-filled. Margaret wore her mother's green velvet dress, altered to fit but still elegant. Thomas had trimmed his beard and wore his one good shirt. Samuel practically vibrated with excitement in his new clothes. Margaret had sewn them secretly, staying up late to finish the jacket. You look beautiful, Thomas said when she descended the stairs. You clean up well yourself, she managed, though her heart was racing. The church service was different this year. When they entered, Widow Patterson waved them over enthusiastically. Ben Cooper nodded greeting. Maria Santos had saved seats. They weren't alone anymore. Even some of the previously cold shoulders had thawed slightly, economic reality having softened judgment. Reverend Phillips spoke about unexpected blessings and hearts opening to receive grace. Margaret felt Thomas's hand find hers during the final hymn, hidden by the pew's high back. She didn't pull away. After service, they returned home to find a surprise, several packages on the porch from their new allies. For Samuel, read one tag. For the family, read another, making Margaret's eyes sting. They opened gifts by the tree. Samuel was beside himself over the carved wooden train Thomas had been secretly making. Margaret gave Thomas a new wool coat she'd ordered from Denver. Thomas gave her a shawl of impossibly soft blue wool that matched her eyes. One more gift, Thomas said, standing suddenly. But it's in the barn. Margaret bundled into her cloak, curious. Samuel started to follow, but Thomas gently stopped him. This one's just for Miss Margaret first, son. Watch the fire for us. The barn was warm, sweet with hay scent. A single lantern cast golden light across the workspace Thomas had created. There, standing against the wall, was a carved fence post, unlike any other. Intricate vines and flowers wound around it. And in the center, carved deep and clear, no fences between us anymore. Thomas. Margaret's voice broke. He took her hands, his calloused fingers gentle around hers. Margaret Stone, you gave us shelter when we had nothing. You stood against your whole town for us. You saved my boy's life. But more than that, you gave us home. You gave us family. You brought light back into our darkness." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "I'm not a rich man. I can't give you standing in society or fancy things. But I can promise you'll never be alone again. I can promise to love you with everything I have, to stand beside you against any storm, to make you smile every day if you'll let me." From his pocket, he pulled a simple gold band, his mother's, he explained, that he'd carried all the way from Nebraska. "Margaret Stone, will you marry me? Will you let Samuel call you mother? Will you let us be the family we've already become?" Margaret's tears came freely now, 20 years of frozen emotion melting like spring snow. She looked at this good man who saw past her walls, who'd mended more than her fences, who offered not rescue, but partnership. "Yes," she whispered, then stronger. "Yes, Thomas. Yes to all of it." He stood and kissed her, soft and reverent, a promise sealed in the barn where it all began. When they broke apart, both were crying and laughing simultaneously. "Can I tell Samuel?" Margaret asked, wiping her cheeks. "Can I tell our son?" Thomas's face transformed with joy at her words. "Our son, yes." They returned to the house hand in hand. Samuel looked up from where he was carefully arranging his train on the hearth. "Samuel," Margaret said, kneeling before him, "your papa has asked me to marry him, and I've said yes. Would you like me to be your mother?" The boy launched himself at her, nearly knocking her over with the force of his hug. "Really, really, truly, you'll be my mama. If you want me to be, I want it more than anything. I already been calling you mama in my head for weeks." He pulled back, suddenly anxious. "Is that okay? Can I call you mama right now?" "Yes, sweet boy. Right now and always." Samuel turned to his father. "Papa, you did it. You said you would at Thanksgiving, and you did." Margaret looked at Thomas in surprise. "Thanksgiving." Thomas had the grace to look sheepish. "He might have helped me plan this." "We made the fence post together," Samuel announced proudly. "I did the flowers 'cause Papa said you liked the wildflowers in spring, and I kept the secret for 3 whole weeks." They sat together by the tree, Samuel tucked between them, planning. A spring wedding when the meadow bloomed. Samuel would carry the rings. Widow Patterson would make her famous wedding cake. The house would be full of their new community of friends. "We'll need to add rooms," Thomas mused. "Maybe a proper workshop attached to the barn. And a bigger chicken coop," Samuel added. "General Grump says he needs more ladies." Margaret laughed, the sound filling the house like music. "Whatever General Grump needs." As midnight approached, they prepared for bed, but properly this time. Thomas would stay in the small room off the kitchen until the wedding. It was propriety, but also anticipation, making their upcoming union all the sweeter for the waiting. "Mama," Samuel said sleepily as she tucked him in, the name still wonderful on his lips. "This is the best Christmas ever." "Yes, my darling boy," she agreed, kissing his forehead. "The best Christmas ever, and the first of many." She met Thomas in the hallway. He caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "Thank you," he said, "for saying yes, for choosing us." "Thank you," she replied, "for showing me I didn't have to be alone, for being patient while I learned to trust again." "Margaret," he said as she turned toward her room, "I love you. I should have said it in the barn, but I was so nervous." She returned to him, framing his face with her hands. "I love you too, Thomas. I think I have for months. Maybe since you fixed that fence without being asked." They stood there in the lamplight, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, hearts beating the same rhythm. Tomorrow would bring wedding plans and continued challenges from the town. But tonight, in this moment, They were complete, a family forged from loneliness and loss, strengthened by adversity, and blessed by love. The carved nativity set on the mantel seemed to glow in the firelight. The tiny family gathered close. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and clean, covering the world in fresh possibilities. The warming pan waited by the stove for cold beds, but the house itself was warm now, filled with something that had been missing for so long: the promise of forever, the certainty of belonging, the miracle of love returning to a heart that had forgotten how to hope. Margaret went to her room but stopped at the window, looking out at the barn where everything had changed. The carved fence post would stand at their gate come spring, a declaration to the town and themselves: no more fences, no more walls, just love, honest and true, strong enough to weather any storm. Spring came to Sage Creek Ranch like a kept promise, painting the meadows with wildflowers and filling the orchard with apple blossoms. Margaret stood before her mirror in the room that had been solely hers for 20 years, wearing her mother's wedding dress, ivory silk yellowed to cream with age, but still beautiful. Widow Patterson had helped her alter it, letting out seams and adding new pearl buttons down the back. "You look radiant," Mary Patterson said, pinning the elderflower crown in Margaret's dark hair, "like a woman who's finally found her happiness." "I'm 43 years old," Margaret said, touching the fine lines around her eyes. "Rather late for a first wedding. Never too late for love, dear. Besides, that man looks at you like you're the sun itself." Through the window, Margaret could see the preparations in the orchard. Thomas and Ben Cooper had built an arbor from willow branches, now wound with early roses from her mother's garden. Samuel raced between the tables they'd set up, his new Sunday suit already showing signs of his enthusiasm, a grass stain on one knee, his collar askew. The transformation of the community's attitude had been gradual but undeniable. When word spread that Margaret had secured the railroad beef contract, which had arrived 2 weeks after her bluff, even the coldest shoulders had begun to thaw. The combination of economic reality and the obvious happiness radiating from the ranch had worn down resistance like water on stone. "The minister's here," Maria Santos announced from the doorway, "and half the town, it seems." Margaret's stomach fluttered. She'd expected their small circle of allies, but curiosity had apparently overcome propriety for many others. Through the window, she saw carriages arriving, some surprising: Dr. Morrison with his wife, the owner of the general store, even Mrs. Phillips, though she stayed near the edges, her expression carefully neutral. "Ready?" Mary asked. Margaret picked up her bouquet wildflowers and sage, tied with her mother's lace handkerchief, from her jewelry box. She took her mother's wedding ring, worn thin but still solid, sliding it onto her right hand for now. After the ceremony, it would move to her left, joining Thomas's mother's ring he'd offered at Christmas. "Ready?" she said, and meant it. The walk to the orchard felt both endless and instant. The gathered crowd turned as she appeared, and she saw Thomas waiting under the arbor, his face transformed with wonder. He wore a new black suit she'd secretly had made in Denver, but it was his expression that made him magnificent: joy and love and promise all written in his eyes. Samuel stood beside him as ring-bearer, practically bouncing with excitement. When he saw her, he started forward as if to run to her, then caught himself, standing straighter with comic seriousness. The ceremony itself was simple. Reverend Phillips, who had found his conscience sometime after Christmas, spoke about second chances and unexpected blessings, about hearts that had been winter dormant flowering again in spring. Margaret barely heard the words, lost in Thomas's eyes, in the solid warmth of his hands holding hers. "The rings," the Reverend prompted. Samuel stepped forward with such gravity that several people chuckled. He presented the simple gold bands on a cushion Margaret had embroidered with forget-me-nots. Thomas took her mother's ring first, sliding it onto her finger. "With this ring, I pledge not just my love but my partnership. We've already weathered storms together. Now let us share the sunshine." Margaret placed his father's ring on his hand. "With this ring, I choose you and Samuel as my family. You've shown me that walls built from hurt only keep out healing. My heart and my home are yours, always. By the power vested in me." Reverend Phillips proclaimed. "I pronounce you husband and wife." Thomas kissed her, tender and brief, but full of promise. The crowd erupted in celebration, some more enthusiastic than others, but all present, all witnessing this new chapter. The reception unfolded like something from a dream. Tables groaned under food provided by the community, Widow Patterson's 3-layer cake decorated with real roses, Ben Cooper's smoked meats, Maria's traditional Mexican wedding cookies. The banker's wife had sent a crystal punch bowl with a card that read simply, "Best wishes." It was as close to an apology as Margaret would get, and more than she'd expected. As the afternoon wore on, surprising conversations bloomed. Harold Whitman approached during a quiet moment, hat literally in hand. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, the new name strange on his lips. "I owe you an apology, and him." He nodded toward Thomas, who was teaching Samuel and other children a dancing game. "I misjudged. The ranch has never looked better. And, well, happiness suits you." Margaret studied her former rival. "Thank you, Harold. That means something. Coming from you." Banker Hayes was more pragmatic in his approach. "The railroad contract is impressive, Margaret. If you need expansion capital for the ranch, the bank would be pleased to discuss terms." "Thomas and I will consider it," she replied, enjoying the way Thomas and I felt on her tongue. The moment she treasured most came as the sun began setting. Dr. Morrison approached with genuine humility. "I should have come during the storm," he said quietly. "When the boy was sick, I let fear override my oath. I'm glad you knew what to do." "We do what we must for family," Margaret replied. "Samuel is strong. He survived. Thanks to you." He paused. "My wife and we'd like to apologize properly. Perhaps you'd all come to dinner next week. Our children are near Samuel's age." It was an olive branch she hadn't expected. "We'd like that." As evening painted the sky purple and gold, the crowd gradually departed, leaving only their closest friends to help clean up. Samuel had fallen asleep in Thomas's arms, exhausted from excitement and too much cake. Margaret touched the boy's hair gently, their son now, legally and truly. "Let me," Ben Cooper offered, beginning to stack chairs. "You three should have your moment." Thomas carried Samuel into the house, laying him gently in his bed, the room they'd prepared specially. Painted blue with wooden shelves Thomas had built for the boy's growing collection of books and treasures. Margaret removed Samuel's shoes, tucking the quilt around him. "Mama," he murmured sleepily, "is it real? Are we really a family now?" "The realest thing in the world," she assured him, kissing his forehead. They left him sleeping and walked back outside, hand in hand, to the front porch. The new garden gate Thomas had installed stood open, the carved fence post with its declaration, "No fences between us anymore," serving as one gatepost. In the fading light, the carving seemed to glow. "Wait," Thomas said, leading her to the gate. "There's one more tradition." He pulled out his knife, kneeling by the opposite gatepost. With careful strokes, he carved 3 sets of initials: T, B, M, B, C, B, and the date. "Now it's complete." Margaret traced the letters with her finger, then placed her hand on the gate. Thomas covered it with his, and they called softly for Samuel, who appeared rubbing his eyes, barefoot but eager. "Put your hand on ours, son," Thomas instructed. 3 hands stacked together on the gate of their home, one large and work-roughened, one elegant but strong, one small but growing. Margaret felt her mother's ring warm on her finger, as if blessing this moment. "This is our promise," Thomas said. "No matter what comes, we stand together. We chose each other, and we keep choosing each other. Every day. Forever and always," Samuel added solemnly, clearly repeating something he'd heard in the ceremony. "Forever and always," Margaret agreed. tears sliding down her cheeks. Joy tears, completion tears, beginning tears. They stood there as full dark arrived, bringing out the stars in crowds like witnesses. The house behind them glowed with lamplight, warm and welcoming. The ranch spread around them, ready for planting, for growth, for the future they'd build together. "I have something for you," Margaret told Samuel, pulling a small package from her pocket. A wedding gift. He opened it to find a pocket knife with his initials carved in the handle. "For your whittling," she explained. "Your father will teach you to use it safely." "My turn," Thomas said, producing a leather-bound journal for Margaret. "For the story of our family. Starting today." They settled on the porch. Samuel between them on the new swing Thomas had hung just that morning. The boy leaned against Margaret's shoulder, his hand in Thomas's, completing their circle. "Tell me again about when you first came here," Samuel requested, already making it mythology. So Margaret told it, with Thomas adding details. About a cold night when two strangers asked for shelter in a barn. About broken fences mended and hearts slowly opening. About choosing love over fear. Community over isolation. Hope over history. "And then what happened?" Samuel asked, though he knew. "Then we became a family," Margaret said, pulling him closer. "The best thing that ever happened to any of us." "The fence brought us together," Thomas mused, looking at the gate with its carved message. "Broken things that needed fixing." "We were all broken," Margaret agreed. "But broken things can be mended stronger than they were before. We're proof of that." An owl called from the barn, and General Grump answered indignantly from the coop, making them all laugh. The sound carried across the ranch, past the mended fences and thriving gardens, into the darkness where it became part of the night's music. Margaret looked at her husband, at their son, at the home they'd made from loneliness and courage. 20 years she'd stood alone on this porch, watching seasons change with no one to share them. Now she had everything: love, family, community, and the promise of all the seasons to come. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked softly. "That Mama was right," she said, surprising herself by speaking of her mother easily for the first time in decades. "She used to say that God's timing is perfect, even when we can't see it. That everything breaks so it can be rebuilt better." "To rebuilding," Thomas said, raising an imaginary glass. "To family," Samuel added sleepily. "To home," Margaret finished. They sat in comfortable silence as the spring night deepened around them. Inside, the wedding gifts waited to be opened, the registry they'd signed to make it legal, the thank you notes to write. Tomorrow would bring the work of the ranch, the continuing navigation of town relationships, the 1,000 small tasks of daily life. But tonight was perfect, complete, and whole, an ending that was really a beginning. The carved gate stood sentinel to their happiness, declaring to anyone who passed that this was a home without fences, where love had overcome fear, where strangers had become family, where broken hearts had learned to trust again. When Samuel finally fell asleep against her shoulder, Thomas carried him inside one more time. Margaret followed, pausing at the threshold to look back at the ranch spread under starlight. The same land, the same buildings, but transformed entirely by the presence of love. She touched her mother's ring, warm and solid on her finger, then stepped inside to begin the rest of her life, their life, built on mended fences and opened gates, strong enough to weather any storm that might come. I've told you this story of Margaret Stone because I believe we all build fences around our hearts, thinking they'll keep us safe. But safety isn't living, it's just existing. Margaret had everything a person needed to survive: land, money, respect born from fear. Yet she was starving for what truly matters: the warmth of a child's laughter at breakfast, the steady presence of someone who sees your worst and chooses to stay, the gentle weight of a small hand in yours. Sometimes grace arrives as a stranger at our gate, asking for nothing more than a night's shelter. Thomas and Samuel didn't just need Margaret's barn, she needed their trust to remember how to give hers. They taught her that family isn't about blood or propriety. It's about who shows up to mend your fences without being asked, who sings through the storm while fever burns, Who stands beside you when the whole town stands against? The fence post still stands at Sage Creek Ranch, weathered but solid, its carved message barely visible now. No fences between us anymore. Because that's what love does. It tears down what we built in fear and builds something better with hope. And isn't that worth being grateful for?